friends, and welcome to the CUInsight Network. My name is Robbie Young. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Growth at CUInsight.com, and it's my job on this show to have conversations with thought leaders who support the credit union community to identify issues affecting credit unions and have a discussion on best practices so that we can all gain a few nuggets and learn and improve our credit unions. My guest for today's show is Bernie Winne, Regional Vice President of Modern Capital Executive Solutions. Bernie, thanks so much for being here.
Robbie, thank you so much for having me this afternoon.
Of course. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Most of us really didn't grow up thinking that we'd work in credit unions. What did you want to be when you grew up?
So I grew up wanting to be a school teacher. And that was something I was working at from probably the time I was about 14 or 15 years of age. I actually realized that dream right after graduating from college and was a teacher coach in a local high school for about 5 years.
That's awesome. I remember playing teacher as a kid. So that was one of the ones on my list too.
I got to play teacher as a kid as well. In that I was a 21-year-old teacher teaching 18 and 19-year-old students.
Wow. What was the journey like to your current role as Regional Vice President at Modern Capital Executive Solutions?
So it's a fairly long journey, and I'll try to make it as brief as possible. I left teaching after about 5 years. I had started in my second year as a teacher working on my MBA. Had kind of decided at that point that I wasn't going to stay in teaching forever. Some of the reason for that was economics, that teachers just really aren't valued in our country and compensation levels just really aren't that great. So I was looking for an exit strategy. A friend of mine's dad offered me a position at a credit union where he was the CEO, very small credit union at the time. I went in as the number 2 person, knowing nothing about credit unions. And he literally taught me the business from the ground up. From that point, I spent the next 42 years in credit unions, total of 4 stops along the way, with the last stop at Boston Firefighters Credit Union, where I was CEO for about 22 years. After I retired, or I should say just before I retired, I met an industry colleague who was working for Modern Capital at the time, and she suggested that I meet her boss. And so I sat down for the very first time with Ryan Millman over lunch in the summer of 2022. And after a lengthy conversation, Ryan invited me to join the team at Modern Capital. That's how I got there.
Well, that was certainly a great job at condensing that journey, because I'm sure there was so much along the way you could have added. Can you tell me a little bit more about Modern Capital and where and how they add value to credit unions?
Modern Capital works in what I would call the impermissible investment space. So NCUA allows credit unions to invest in what are otherwise impermissible activities, as long as the proceeds are being used in one of 3 ways. Executive compensation retirement plans is one. The second is charitable donation accounts. And the third is pre-funding employee benefits. So if credit unions are using the proceeds of these investments for any of those activities, they can leave the list of approved investments and seek what are usually significantly better returns someplace else.
Wow, that's really interesting. So for our listeners, I've been really looking forward to this discussion because the ability you all have to attract and retain top talent is super important with credit unions. Can you share a little bit about the use of supplemental executive retirement plans as a tool for credit unions of all sizes in the battle to attract and retain that executive level talent?
I'm happy to, Robbie. So that's really one of the biggest focus points for Modern Capital. We spend a lot of time trying to educate credit unions, trying to educate boards of directors about the use of SERPs to attract and retain the talent that they need to keep their credit unions competitive. It's a very strong play for a board that has a CEO or even people other than the CEO, so other C-suite employees, that they wish to keep around for a long period of time. So we can construct plans in a couple of different ways, and I can get into that a little bit more later, but just staying with it conceptually for a moment, credit unions of all sizes can find a way to do this. It's something that's been happening for a number of years. A lot of people look at it as the domain of the larger credit unions, and statistically speaking, it probably is. If you look at credit unions over $1 billion in total asset size, most recent surveys are saying that somewhere around 85% of the CEOs in those credit unions are covered by a SERP. And if you look at the next level down, so let's call it the C-suite talent, somewhere between 60 and 70% of those people are covered by a SERP. So you can see that in the larger credit unions, this is something that's been happening for quite some time. What is happening lately is that smaller credit unions, and by smaller, I'm not talking about people who just missed the $1 billion club. I'm talking about credit unions that are significantly smaller. I just finished doing a SERP for the CEO of a small credit union down in the South that I've known the credit union for a bit of time. And it was an opportunity to, number one, reward the CEO for the time that she's already put into the credit union, but at the same time, make sure that if the phone is ringing with offers from other institutions, that her answer is coming back as a no, and giving the board the peace of mind that they're looking for.
That's really interesting and so important for credit unions when they're building their teams. How can Modern Capital come alongside credit unions to support them?
So we try to meet credit unions where they are. We spend a lot of time in the field. We go to the typical credit union conferences. We love to sit down and talk with board members. We love to sit down and talk with CEOs and C-suite personnel. And the conversation varies significantly. So in many cases, you're talking to a CEO who's already knowledgeable. In some cases, you're even talking to board members who are knowledgeable. And in those cases, the conversation that we're having is more along the lines of, are you happy with your current plan? And that's more of a CEO or a C-suite conversation than it is a board conversation. Sometimes plans were put in place a number of years ago, and the economics of the plan just really aren't what they should be in 2024 heading into 2025. So at that point, our focus is to try to see if we can help the CEO, CFO, COO, whoever it might be, with what I will call an audit of their existing plan, showing how it stacks up against what a new plan in this time frame would look like, and offering them some opportunities to maybe take their plan in a different direction. The other conversations that we have are going to be with people where there is not a SERP currently in place. Sometimes that's a situation where there's a new CEO. Sometimes that's a situation like the one I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, where there's been a CEO for a long period of time, but nobody has taken time to talk to them about setting up a plan. So those conversations can look a little different. I'm going to almost say that no two conversations are exactly the same. If I have an opportunity to prepare for a conversation, one of the first things I'm going to do is to pull the call report data from that credit union and take a look at what they're already doing, so that when I sit down with whoever it may be, I have an idea of what kind of exposure they have and what kind of returns they're generating. And then I can have maybe a stronger conversation from the very beginning. But as I said, no two conversations are the same. It really just depends upon what the credit union is trying to achieve. The conversation with board members can often be a little bit different than the conversation with the CEO. Conversation with the CEO, or I keep saying CEO, but that you can substitute CEO for C-suite member. When we're talking with those people, we're really talking about trying to create a benefit for them in retirement. So we're trying to enhance their retirement. We're trying to provide additional funds. For the board, it's the other side of the same coin. It's how do we make this look like a retention strategy? How do we convince board members that by putting a plan like we're talking about in place, they make it difficult for that C-suite member to leave? So depending upon whether I'm talking to a board member or talking to a C-suite member, the conversation is different. However, at the end of the day, those two conversations have to come together, because in order to put something into place, the C-suite people and the board members have to get to the same page. And that's a really interesting thing because there's a little bit of compromise involved. As you can imagine, the C-suite person wants the best benefit that they can possibly get. And as you can also probably imagine, boards doing their fiduciary thing the way they should be doing it can be a little bit on the conservative side. And so when we're looking at putting together a plan and we're making certain assumptions and we're calculating certain values, there's a lot of negotiation that goes on between the two parties to get to something that everybody can be comfortable with. And I think that's the value that we provide. I know that that's the value that I provide. I sat in the CEO seat, so I know what that looks like. And I spent a lot of years talking to my board. I also had the privilege while I was working to work a lot around the country at various organizations and with various speaking engagements and met a lot of board members while I was doing that. So while I can't tell you I know how every board member thinks, I feel like I do know how boards collectively think. And I can go into a boardroom and in a couple of minutes can read the room and find out what I'm dealing with and how best to present the case to the board so that we get to a successful conclusion.
Giving back to the communities is an important part of the credit union industry. I know you have some great insights on how credit unions can utilize charitable donation accounts to increase their levels of giving without taking away from their bottom line. Can you share a little bit of that information with our listeners?
Sure, Robbie, I'd be happy to. I think the charitable donation accounts are one of the best kept secrets in the credit union industry. When I look at call reports across the industry, I often see credit unions of all sizes that are not taking advantage of this opportunity. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we specialize in helping credit unions with impermissible investments. Charitable donation accounts are one of the uses of impermissible investments. So I'm going to pick an example and say if a credit union has $10 million in capital, they can use up to 5% of that money. So that would be $500,000 in a charitable donation account. Now, the key to a charitable donation account is how the funds are invested. So credit unions want to be conservative, and I applaud them for being conservative. But we have a number of options for conservative credit unions, options where the principal is not at risk, and we can see returns in the high single digits and even approaching 10%. So allow me just to use 10% as a number. And that's the high end of what we can do, but we can reach 10%. So if a credit union takes that same $500,000 and invests it and gets a 10% return, then they're getting $50,000 a year. That $50,000 a year has to be spent 50% on charitable donations. So they would have to spend at least $25,000 of charitable donations. That's the NCUA coming in and saying that if you're going to take advantage of the CDA authority, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're using half of the proceeds. But the other half of the proceeds can go to the bottom line. So we're now taking our charitable account and we're making it a profit center for the credit union because they're earning that full amount of money that we talked about. They're using half of that money for charity. The rest of it is going to the bottom line. And to really understand the benefit of that, you've got to do a side-by-side comparison. You've got to take the credit union that doesn't do any kind of charitable activity under a CDA. They do it just straight out of their income and expense statement. So you look at that on one side, you look at what they're spending, which is a pure expense. And then you look at what we can do with the CDA. And that credit union is actually doing their charitable activity for something that's pretty close to free while still making a bottom line return. So it's just a great opportunity for credit unions. The past couple of years have been a little bit of a challenge on CDAs. The main reason has been there has not been a lot of liquidity in the credit union system. I'm sure some of the other conversations that you've heard the woes of credit unions who built up significant amounts of liquidity and then saw the deposits run off after COVID money was spent and then got into situations where they really didn't have liquidity and were struggling to fund loan demand. It's been difficult for us to convince credit unions to look at CDAs when they're in a situation where they don't have liquidity. But we're starting to see that change. We're starting to see that turn. We're starting to see credit unions have more liquidity. We're also starting to see returns on traditional investments come back down. Return on overnight funds got over 5%. Now, the Fed's been in the market twice for a total of 75 basis points, bringing that return down now into the lower fours. And conventional wisdom seems to think that they're going to continue that at least for a little bit of 2025. So if all of those things are true, there is more liquidity. Traditional investments are paying less. We still have some great opportunities in impermissible investments. And all the credit union has to agree to do is to use half of the money for charity and keep the other half in their profit and loss statement.
Such great information. As we look into the future, what is Modern Capital's focus on the road ahead?
So I think the road ahead is a very challenging road for credit unions. The past couple of years have been really difficult. And I think one of the biggest challenges that credit unions face, it's back to something we talked about earlier, but it's how do they attract and retain C-suite talent? I was in the industry, as I said earlier, for about 40 years. And I think one of the things that as an industry we didn't do a great job of was building our own bench. So we didn't necessarily have a lot of good people in the waiting. And as a result, credit unions have gone out in some cases and pulled people in from other industries, banking as an example. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk negatively about people who come in from the banking industry. All I'm just trying to highlight is the fact that we do not have enough talent in the credit union industry to replace the CEOs, CFOs, COOs who are retiring. And there are a lot of people in credit union space who are retiring. It ties into what we do. We think that what we do ties into succession planning. So it's all about retaining talent, but it's also all about attracting the right talent. And in both cases, having a nice SERP package, or maybe better said, having a nice SERP philosophy at the credit union is just a great way to bring the right people into your credit union, but then also reward the people who are in your credit union and the people that you're hoping to keep there for quite some time. I think credit unions that embrace that kind of a philosophy, credit unions that do succession planning, and with doing succession planning, do the appropriate amount of compensation planning, they're going to be fine. They're going to be okay. They're going to be successful. The credit unions that don't do that may still be successful, but they're certainly going to have some challenges along the way. Our job is to partner with the credit unions that want to do that. Our job is to do whatever they need us to do to help them build that strategy and to help them to be successful in the long term.
Always having that focus on building stronger credit unions. To wrap up the show, I'd like to have some fun with some rapid fire questions to let our listeners really get to know you better. The questions are rapid, but of course your answers do not have to be. Who's someone in your life that was a great leader and what made them great?
There are a lot of people that I've encountered in the credit union industry who were great leaders. And so given that this article or this interview is focused on credit union industry, I'm going to talk about one person. So I had the opportunity in Massachusetts to be chairman of the board of the Massachusetts League a number of years ago. And the CEO of the league at the time was a guy by the name of Dan Egan. Dan's very well known in the credit union space. He's been retired for a number of years, but I was a relatively young board chairman at the Massachusetts League at the time and learned quite a bit working under Dan or working with Dan. I guess as chairman, he was technically working under me, but he was the seasoned veteran and I had the opportunity to learn quite a bit at his side.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm sure you've got to meet so many people, so it's probably super exciting for someone to get held out on the top of that list. If you're going to splurge on something and you really want to treat yourself, what's one thing that you might invest in a bit?
So I'm going to answer that a little differently. I'm not going to answer as much as a tangible thing that I would invest in. My dream has always been, and my wife and I have been fortunate to be able to do it on a number of occasions, but to just go on a very nice Caribbean vacation. When I was working full-time and she was working full-time, we treated ourselves to that on an annual basis and just spent days lying on the beach and nights having nice dinners and waking up the next morning and doing the same thing all over again. So I guess I'm going to answer it that way.
Well, that is very sweet. A random question. I know you get to travel a bit for work. What city have you been most excited to visit or are most excited to visit? And whether it's a client visit or going to a conference, what city stands out the most for you?
I'm glad you didn't ask the flip side of that and ask which city I don't like to visit, because I probably wouldn't want to answer that for fear of alienating potential clients. But given that I live as far on the East Coast as you can, my favorite place to visit, and probably a place that if I had to do it all over again, I would even contemplate living, is San Diego, California. I just love the climate there, whether you're there in January or whether you're there in July. The temperature is consistent. It's just beautiful. And I just enjoy being out there.
As someone who is also on the East Coast, I can understand that. What's a book that you think everyone should read?
You know, when I was CEO of the credit union, I'm going to say I forced, and that's not a good word, but let me say I heavily suggested that my team at the credit union read the book Good to Great. And I just thought that was a tremendous way of exposing them to some thoughts about management that made a lot of sense. And there was one particular area of the book that we highlighted and spoke quite a bit about. And the essence of it was to get the right people on the bus, but then maybe more importantly, to get the right people in the right seats on the bus. And that was a philosophy that I tried to use, but I also tried to get the people who were managing people within my credit union to think the same way. Think about the talent that you have. Think about, do you have the right talent? And then think about, do you have the right talent performing the right tasks?
We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so that everyone else can take a look at that as well. What has been the best life hack for creating balance and integration between your work life and your life? And you already mentioned your trips to the Caribbean, so I guess that can't be one of them.
You know, I think probably people of my generation were not as good at work-life balance as people who are coming up now. I think we grew up with this idea of work hard and you'll get ahead, and work hard regardless of what that means. And I'm not going to say that I was a slave to the job, but I put a lot of time and effort into the credit union and into the credit union industry. And I think I have to say that there were some sacrifices made at home and some opportunities where the work-life balance was probably a little bit tilted to work and probably not as tilted to life as I would have liked it to have been. But you need to know that I started working in credit unions in 1981, and it was just a very different world. And the idea of you got ahead by working hard was really a mindset. I can remember my second job in the credit union space. I had a very strong executive vice president who I was working for. I was vice president of operations. And just as an example, I would not let him beat me to the office in the morning, and I would not leave the office at night until he was gone. I felt like I needed to convince him, not just through my work, but just physically and visually convince him that I was there. So a little bit different than the way people think today. And I think in many respects, the way people think today is better, but I'm not going to give them it's a 100% better. I think sometimes the people today need to get a little bit more work
That's a super interesting perspective. And I'm sure your team is glad that the race to the office and the last person out of the office is not super high on your list now.
It wasn't the way that I managed. It was, again, my experience that I cited was back in the mid 80s. And I've said it before, but the world was a different place. I didn't manage that way. I had a staff that had a lot of working mothers who really had a lot going on in their lives outside of what was going on in the credit union. And I needed to provide the flexibility that they needed in order to make it work.
Well, I will say, Bernie, as somebody who has gotten the opportunity to meet you quite a few times, I wouldn't believe you if you did tell me that you operated that way anyway. But thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I would like to remind everyone to please stay well, and thanks for listening to the CUInsight Network. We'll be back again next time. Thank you.